over to the live cam. We're going to cut straight in. Next up is Doc Curry, who is a first-year PhD student and Bennett doctoral scholar for liberal arts in political science at York University, Canada. So you're part of the North American contingent. It's really great. Like we've really gone international with this thing. His interests are in situationist theory and praxis, speculative materialism, speculative empiricism, and post-phenomenological comportments towards the environmentalism and ecology. So without further ado, we're going to give Doc Curry on the Ecological Inhuman War Machine thesis on Malthus.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I got a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time, so I'm going to try to speed through this here. Number one, Malthus was wrong. You can't make specific predictions about food shortages, be held at bay for 200 years, and then pop out of the birthday cake and show I was right. In fairness, though, we should then ask whether the things that prove Malthus wrong in his doom and gloom predictions surrounding population dynamics are now themselves meeting their own limitations. The Neo-Malthusian believes that Malthus was only proved wrong by technical innovation and resource development, whereas the Post-Malthusian believes that Malthus was proved wrong by technical innovation, resource development, as well as the checks upon technical innovation and resource development by the populations and communities that such technical innovation and resource development occur within, along with their cooperation amongst those populations and communities in everyday life. If you orient yourself towards Malthus as the figures of the Englishman and the German do, you will say, yes, Malthus was proved wrong in the specifics, but he will yet be proved right in general. This orientation is Neo-Malthusian and is best described by ecologist Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, where he critiques those who advocate only, quote, a change only in the techniques of the natural sciences, demanding little or nothing in the way of change in human values or ideas of morality, end quote. Whereas if you orient yourself towards Malthus as the figures of the Russian and the Frenchman do, you will say, of course Malthus was proved wrong in his specifics, but his being wrong in the specifics belies his more fundamental error, the curious absence of a notion of mutual aid. The Neo-Malthusian believes that Malthus will yet be proved right because the characters that populate an environment survive through competition. The Post-Malthusian believes that Malthus will continue to be proved wrong through those characters coming to one another's aid. 2. The Englishman and the German profess rational inhumanism, but are functionally and exclusively humanist. The Russian and the Frenchman profess socialist humanism, but are functionally and inclusively humanist. England and Germany have long had the luxury of pure rationation, pure contemplation. Their supplicant vassal states have afforded them this luxury. As Nick Land so eloquently puts it, quote, modernity has ethno-geographical characteristics that complicate and qualify its mathematical purity, end quote. In other words, the Germans furnished the sanction and the English furnished the means of a paranoid colonial authority which takes Malthus as a given and which, as a rule, reduces actual characters of a delimited colonial environment to their figuration within a rationalist mathematical modeling, and then pats itself on the back for having benevolently modeled those characters at all. Indeed, as Land notes, quote, as an inevitable consequence, the modernistic self-consciousness of the system's ethno-geographical core slid towards racial panic, in a process that was only arrested by the rise and immolation of the Third Reich, end quote. That is, their paranoia surrounding their own ethno-geographical particularity, coupled with a tacit acceptance of Malthus, produced from their pure reasonings the practical consequence of a regime of hierarchy and exclusion, and ultimately the logic of the camp. This panic is indissociable from the modes of exclusion implied in the Neo-Malthusian philosophy. The Neo-Malthusian articulates inhumanism on the basis of reason, but privileges humanity as that which reasons, meaning that it remains functionally humanist. It slides today towards ecocidal panic. It is not hard to find evidence of humanism in the Russian and French lineage. It's hard not to find it. It is indeed everywhere, and finds its ultimate expression in Marxist humanism, though this superfluous humanism in Marx, the scurrilous influence of Hegel, the German, is happily jettisoned in the work of Peter Kropotkin, tracing rigorously the deployment of mutual aid in evolutionary development. The Neo-Malthusian starts with the assumption that the some characters of a given environment cannot change or comport themselves differently among one another, and hence the Neo-Malthusian conspires politically to build a better padded cell, as in China's barbarous and elitist one-child policy. The Post-Malthusian, by way of contrast, believes that the some characters of a given environment can change or comport themselves differently to one another as indeed toward their environment, and hence conspires to aid and educate and learn from one another, even if that aid comes in the form of, and the mutual education produces, a fundamental change in one's own behavior. As Land notes, quote, evolution is dominated by feedback of the evolved activities of organisms on their evolution, end quote. Next, Darwin was a Russian. Darwin was strongly influenced by Malthus, but it was curiously Darwin himself who articulated how Malthus was wrong, writing, quote, those communities which indeed included the greatest number of, those communities which included the greatest number of most sympathetic members would flourish best. As Kropotkin writes, the narrow-Malthusian conception of competition between each and all thus lost its narrowness in the mind of one who knew nature, end quote. This is, however, not the Darwin that has been so poorly caricatured, so we will say that thesis 3, for clarity, is that Darwin was a Russian. 4. Empirical science is an empirical and historical process, the work of our Rylean ancestors. I'd like to draw your attention to two myths, the myth of the given and the myth of Jones. Wilfred Sellers invites us to imagine a community of our Rylean ancestors who can articulate public, quote, public properties of public objects located in space and enduring through time, end quote, but do not yet, quote, recognize each other and themselves as animals that think, observe, and have feelings and sensations as we use these terms, end quote. Named after the anti-Cartesian Gilbert Ryle, this population is meant to demonstrate how no epistemic knowledge is, as Cornel West writes, quote, self-justifying, intrinsically credible, theory-neutral, or non-inferential, end quote. It is a critique of the myth of the given, but Sellers conflates, to the detriment of his theory, the given of Cartesian rationalists, innate ideas, the given of logical positivists, phenomenalism, the given of materialism, ontological naturalism, and the givens of eliminative materialism, deterministic neuroscience. Leaving aside the first two, there might be some Carnap scholars in the crowd, but we can talk about it later. If there are Cartesian rationalists in the crowd, you can spare me. The main bone of contention is between the latter two, in spite of eliminative materialists having conveniently forgotten that they need a variant of the former as a possibility of the latter. That is, they need to have some sort of ontological naturalism to have neuroscience. Eliminative materialists have taken up Sellers even though he doesn't ultimately support their position. The confusion arises from Sellers' introduction of the myth of Jones. That is, within the community of our Rylean ancestors, who can discourse about public objects but not about their internal episodes, there emerges a genius, Jones, who, quote, develops a theory according to which overt utterances are but the culmination of a process which begins with certain inner episodes, end quote. The fact is that there never was a singular Jones, but rather Jones is a cipher for the history and development of a science which admits of many things, and indeed this is precisely what both Sellers and Paul Churchland stress in clarifying that their hypothetical genius Jones, who develops an account of conceptual enunciation, is a methodological rather than philosophical behaviorist. That is, as Churchland writes, he quote, maintains a firm contact with empirical reality, end quote. By way of contrast, the eliminative materialist today, so convinced is he by the absolute errancy of the folk political, proceeds to bully others into capitulating to his own normative political positions. That is, the positions that the eliminative materialist secretly harbors. As Isabel Stenger writes of eliminative materialism, quote, this is a good position in the academic game, but a position that is not connected with any possibility of struggle. It rather emphasizes the power of the capitalist to do and undo, and all that the theorists can tell to the besieged, angry, or protesting scientists is despair, lose your illusions, that what you were doing was worth doing, was mattering, eliminative materialism indeed, end quote. Science is a wonderful thing, though it remains, as Kropotkin writes, quote, to this day permeated with Malthus teachings, end quote. This one I'm going to skip. I just wanted to note, this is a freebie for the critics. Rather than our real Rylean ancestors, if you want to take a Lovecraftian Thulu take on this, our Rylean ancestors. This one I'm going to skip mostly, but I will tell you that Ecology has no truck with economy. Essentially, this point, I'll put up more information about this one online, but basically the point is that economy, the law of the household, results in a form of triage of ecology. A triage that is arbitrated by that which reasons, i.e. the human. It is a humanist triage. Economy is a humanist triage of ecology. The one thing I want to note, Malthus gave to the rich, as Kropotkin writes, quote, a kind of scientific argument against the ideas of equality. The theory of Malthus, by shaping into a pseudo-scientific form the secret desires of the wealth-possessing classes, became the foundation of a whole system of practical philosophy, which permeates the minds of both the educated and undereducated, and reacts, as practical philosophy always does, upon the theoretical philosophy of our century, end quote. The only other thing I want to note about that is, as Stephen Jay Gould writes, I would note that Kropotkin's basic argument is correct. If Kropotkin overemphasized mutual aid, most Darwinians in Western Europe have exaggerated competition just as strongly. If Kropotkin drew inappropriate hope for social reform from his concept of nature, Darwinians have erred just as firmly, and for motives that most of us would now decry, in justifying imperial conquest, racism, and oppression of the industrial workers as the harsh outcomes of a natural selection in the competitive mode, end quote. 6. The ecological inhuman war machine is minoritarian. This one I'm also gonna give short shrift to because for time. But Deleuze and Guattari note in Thousand Plateaus that there's no war machine inherent to nature, and they're right. There isn't. Not that matter is merely inert. No, it is imbricated within many assemblages. Some make war, some don't. It simply doesn't make war itself. What there is, however, is the war machine composed of the consequences of the war machines of human rationation. These consequences filter through the processes of the natural. They calculate in the sense that Manuel de Landa has gestured to regarding bubbles, and this is what is meant here by the ecological inhuman war machine. We say war machine as this symphony of consequences nevertheless takes the form of those, quote, nomad interventions, which, as Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, enter into de facto mixes with the elements of migration, itinerancy, and transhumanance, which introduce always mixed objects or combinations of space and composition, which react back upon the war machine from the beginning, end quote. The threat that the ecological inhuman war machine poses to the members of the ecological whole, humans included, is far less the result of masses overloading Earth's carrying capacity and far more the result of bourgeois attempts to fundamentally transfigure that carrying capacity. Need I say more than the war against the sun? But I will leave that aside for right now. I want to note Sarah's writing, quote, quicksand is swallowing the duelists, the river is threatening the fighter, earth, waters, and climate, the mute world, the voiceless things once placed as a decor surrounding the usual spectacles, all those things that never interested anyone, from now on thrust themselves brutally and without warning into our schemes and maneuvers. They burst out on our vague cosmetic idea of the nature. Global history enters nature, global nature enters history. This is something entirely new in philosophy. To the extent that we force the consequences of reason back in the face of the arbiters of reason, we are of the ecological inhuman war machine. 7. Am I on 7? Yeah, 7. Neo-Malthusians are the immature capitalistic children of Timothy Leahry. I will not go into this too much, but I will say that in the last decades of Timothy Leary's life, he articulated what he referred to as SMILE. That is the necessity of space migration, increased intelligence, and life extension. I disagree with you radically. Now, I will say that these 11 theses, I will give credit. The ideas expressed at this conference are amazing. I would like to say that these theses are a footnote on Aaron's talk yesterday, Kira's talk yesterday, Sam's talk, and Francis's talk. But I will indict Francis as one who would ultimately love SMILE, some free space migration, increased intelligence, and life extension, combating the decay of nature. As Whitehead writes, philosophers have worried themselves about remote consequences, and in the inductive formulations of science, they should better confine their attention to the immediate rush of transition. Their explanations would then be seen in their native absurdity. But I won't go into. If you want to talk about this later, I'd be glad to. But I think that it's a fundamentally neo-Malthusian position to want these sorts of things as a way to maintain the station of bourgeois subjectivity in the face of an ecological whole that rejects bourgeois subjectivity. 8. Post-Malthusians are Visigoth-trivial. Triviality, as Whitehead writes, quote, is lack of coordination in the factors of the datum, width without narrowness in its higher categories, an excess of incompatible differentiation. Non-triviality represents an imposition of order, the imperial coordination of the factors of the datum, the supremacy of narrowness over width, the local over the global, and a suppression of difference. This imperial coordination is threatened by the Visigoth horde it attempts to impose order upon, and indeed post-Malthusians are therefore among the ranks of the Visigoth-trivial, the armada proper to, as Whitehead writes, quote, the sum characters of the various societies of actual entities which jointly constitute that environment, end quote. Incompatible differentiation is here to be read as incommensurability, and incommensurability as that which foregrounds the possibility of pluralism. This is the one I love most. 9. Galileo is Ptolemaic. Where previously there was, as Malthus writes, a, quote, essential alliance between the Galilean and the Copernican revolutions, end quote, there is now no such alliance. The alliance is over. Where the Copernican wolf pack previously included Galileo, he is herein figured as saboteur, traitor, and crypto-Ptolemist. Quote, this is Malthus, quote, in the discourse of the empirical, it is the discourse of the empirical sciences which for the first time gives meaning to the idea of a rational debate about what did or did not exist prior to the emergence of humankind, as well as about what might eventually succeed humanity, end quote. Empirical science, again, a process, not a rationation, that is a process of science, of scientific communities with real constraints, real particularities, of more or less funding, of more or less proximity to the things. And I say with a pain in my heart that in Canada right now the scientific edifices are being murdered one by one by an ostensibly fascistic conservative government propped up by a quirk of a split left. So the left is split, and they've traded on that to ostensibly murdered the scientific edifices of Canada. They shut down the experimental lakes region this week. They're literally, probably today, rolling up the shutters on the ELA, and they've replaced the Arctic research labs with ones devoted with language that essentially gestures towards resource extraction. Is mathematics useful? Sure, obviously. Can it tell us anything about what our priorities are or how we ought to act as incredibly finite members of an ecological whole? No, absolutely it can't. So for however powerful the modeling tech deployed by contemporary scientists may be, their development, and indeed the necessity of their development, has been an empirical and a historical one. And indeed, more often than not, their necessity has been premised upon and have been deployed towards bourgeois ends, resource development, warfare, and the societies of control. All rationalisms in their being rationalisms are Galilean and bourgeois. They appear to decenter the subject, but secretly place them in the role of the priest, or he who speaks to the divine. They effect not a Ptolemaic counter-revolution, but rather an originary hypocrisy within the Copernican revolution that they purport to effect. This is the animal farm dilemma on ecological scale. Everyone is equal, says the rationalist, to the nature that he nonetheless extricates himself from, except me. I'm somehow more equal than you because I can rationally divine things synthetically and a priori. And then, of course, the qualifiers pseudo and universal are yelled down the Metzinger ego tunnel of subjectivity as though they have any functional importance to the nature left behind, neglected and debased. The Galilean variant of the Copernican revolution is therefore functionally epicilic. In other words, while it appears to affect a decentering of the subject, while it appears to be Copernican, it is nonetheless still revolving upon the imaginary orbits of the Ptolemaic that the Ptolemaic must construct in order to keep themselves primary. Galileo is falsely Copernican. And then this one I'm going to give super short shrift to, but I think it's worth noting. I said this to a prof of mine at Western, Călin Mihălescu, and he mulled it over for a minute. He said, Galileo is Ptolemaic inasmuch as Ptolemeus was a ploughman without land. And I think that this is exceptionally relevant because my concern here and my critique against mathematical modeling is how much or how little of the empirical is admitted into those models. And I don't really accept that most people who advocate for mathematical modeling as a normative political ethos have a good understanding of what the breadth of the empirical that would be necessary to justify this. The last one. Post-Malthusians are folk political. The folk political is neither wholly, and this is this picking fights here. The folk political is neither wholly the folk political is neither wholly folk psychological nor in any way opposed to the neurological and the material. It is indeed its greatest expression. Humans, and by using that term I by no means imply a coterminous break between them and their material composition, sense and feel the originary dispossession of so-called primitive accumulation, and its consequences in their own communities and abroad. As though Siddhartha leaving his palace and being told, much to his surprise, that everything grows old, decays, and dies, some much faster than others, due to the material inequality. Every non-standard philosopher who speaks truth to power, every two-bit lumpen proletariat street rat who smashes up a Starbucks is folk political and post-Malthusian at heart. Neither phenomenology nor reason is the ultimate foundation of our knowledge, but the empirical is. The self-sufficient positively grounded upon itself, as Marx writes, quote, the self-grounded position of sense certainty, end quote. The folk political does not advocate for bloody revolution by necessity, but it doesn't demand revolution. It demands dissent, civil disobedience, the mutual support of popular struggles like Occupy or LGBTQ rights, environmentalism, and the Canadian First Nation protests of Idle No More and the Quebec student protests. We do not need a common language imposed from above. We will develop lingua francas amongst ourselves. We don't need a better cage or a more benevolent nanny state or a more enlightened caste of mathematically minded oligarchical elites. Malthus was wrong, and it is the folk political Visigoth-trivial, ecologically cognizant post-Malthusians that will ensure he stays wrong. And the last thing I'd like to note is that I'm very, very pleased and thankful to be allowed here. Thank you. Yeah. And that last part, I just want to say thank you to all those weird, terrifying, amazing, sublime, broken, disfigured, fragmentary nomad scientists, minor literature scholars, for their dark philosophy, different thinking, and necessary contingent passions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that's very important.